Please be seated. She titled the work of art, "The Moral Arc of the Universe Ideally Bends Toward Justice, but just as often as not bends towards sadism, barbarism, and unrestrained chaos." It's a work of art that Cara Walker created in 2010. It's a work of graphite on pastel. And sort of in the center of the image, you see President Obama or someone like him at a podium. And she made this in 2010, and I think it's supposed to recall his famous speech on race that he gave in March of 2008, when he was still Senator Obama. It's his famous speech on race he gave in Philadelphia at the Constitution Center. Probably the best speech of that whole campaign, which was a campaign full of really amazing speeches. In that speech, he was talking about his pastor, Jeremiah Wright. He was talking about race in America and his own biracial history, and he was saying how his faith in God and his faith in America drove him to believe that despite all the wounds in our body politic, that if we work together, we might actually get beyond some of the past racial wounds. And he said, this is the only path we have to go forward to form a more perfect union. That was the title of his speech, A More Perfect Union. So in Cara Walker's work, now in 2010, when President Obama, or Senator Obama has now been elected president, you have a figure of Obama there, but then all around him you have these quite shocking graphic depictions of violence, Reconstruction era, post-Reconstruction era violence done on African Americans. The work is so graphic that when it was put up at the Newark Public Library, the African American staff there complained and asked that it be censored, it be covered up. It's too graphic, it's too strong. And I think her work gives us a helpful lens to think about today's gospel reading from John. One of the most famous lines in this really famous prologue is the idea that light came into the darkness and that the darkness cannot overcome the light. But why do we believe that? On what basis, besides the preacher or the Bible saying it, do you actually believe that the darkness cannot overcome the light? Certainly, looking at American history, that doesn't seem true. So there was a few years right after the Civil War where things looked like we were progressing. There were two African American lieutenant governors of South Carolina in the early 1870s. But just a few years later, one of them, at his death, was working as a waiter at the Jefferson Club in Washington, D.C. And the other one, when he died in 1907, he was a street sweeper in Charleston, South Carolina. The darkness does not overcome the light, really? And then in 1915, President Woodrow Wilson shows the first film at the White House, The Birth of a Nation. A remarkable film, technically, but also unbelievably racist and unhistorical, and valorizes the KKK. They're the heroes of the story, the KKK. And he shows this film in the White House, he's president. And this is a man who has a PhD in American history, who was the president of Princeton University. And after the lights came up, he said, that was like a picture made of lightning. And the sad fact is that every single thing in that movie was true. This is the President of the United States, was a doctorate in United States history, the president of Princeton University, saying this film that rewrites the history of the post-Civil War era to make the KKK literally the heroes of the story, but that is actually real history. That's the truth. So sad, but I'm glad we could finally talk about the truth. And so on what basis, besides just me saying it or the church believing it, Can we actually say that the darkness does not overcome the light, especially when right now we might say, somewhat fairly, I think, without being partisan, that maybe we're at another moment when the progress that we all took for granted in the last 40 or 50 years, since the late 60s, maybe now seems to be going in an opposite direction. I mean, Cara Walker's title is a play, it's a sardonic play on something Martin Luther King Jr. used to always say in his sermons in his career. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Do you know the last time he said that? It was March 31st, 1968, at National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., about 5 days before he was assassinated. So there he is saying the moral arc of the universe is bending toward justice, and then he's going to be assassinated just a few days later. So how can we possibly believe this is true? It doesn't really seem true. So a little bit later on in the prologue, it says, God dwelt among us. That the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And that word in Greek, that verb, it's sort of an odd verb. It's a verb made of a noun. And the noun that it's made up of is actually tabernacle. That's literally the word in Greek. So the Word became flesh and tabernacled, became a tabernacle among us. And John is using that very specifically because when you hear that word tabernacle, skene in Greek, that is the same word that translates the Old Testament word tabernacle in the Greek Septuagint. And so you're supposed to think, oh yeah, I remember the tabernacle from Moses. The people had left the wilderness. They had come to Mount Sinai. They got the Ten Commandments, and then God tells them to build a tabernacle at the base of the mountain, and they build this tent thing. And after they build it, what happens? Then God's presence fills the tabernacle. Shekinah in Hebrew, the Shekinah comes and fills the tabernacle. And so that is an image that the people of God had held. That's where we meet God. Where do you meet God? You meet God in the tabernacle in the wilderness. That then when they come into the promised land, then Solomon builds the temple, same idea, that houses the presence of God. And John is saying, very strangely, that now, 1,000 years later or so, that this baby that was born, that the presence of God, like the presence of God in the tabernacle in the desert, like the presence of God at Solomon's temple, that somehow that presence, that Shekinah, now exists in a baby. So when I asked you, how can we possibly believe that the darkness doesn't overcome the light, we have to start here. That when we say that, we don't mean that there is going to be that back in history when Jesus came, suddenly he was a warrior and he fixed everything permanently. Clearly that didn't happen. But rather that somehow when Jesus was born as a baby, just a baby, a vulnerable little baby, that somehow in that figure, the actual presence of the God that created the entire universe was right there. And somehow in that reality is the belief and the action that makes the darkness not overcome the light. And so what does that mean for us? That means that as you think about what's going to happen in the next month, 4 years, 12 years, 50 years, right? These backlashes don't just take a particular term. This is now a real turn in our history where we'll now see maybe multi-decades effort of unwinding a lot of the progress that we thought we could take for granted growing up, right? And so how do we face that reality? We face that reality in the same way that Jesus, as a baby and then as he grew up and as he ministered, faced his reality of a darkness that was constantly creeping in to the light. And how did he do that? He did that in his being by being the thing that he was fighting against. right? So he was trying to tell people, I need you to love each other. And he modeled that by he himself loving other people, especially people he disagreed with. And so for us, in this moment, in this particular moment in history that now we're going to go back, the moral arc of history in our generation is not going to bend toward justice. It's going to bend toward something a little more darker. How do we fight against this? We in ourselves incarnate love, like that little baby Jesus, especially love for our enemies, especially love for people that we do not agree with politically, who we feel are taking things in a wrong direction. We have to love them, period. That's it. Love them anyway. Because when Jesus was dying on the cross and he was being betrayed, he did not say, God, let's bring down the lightning bolts and just take care of all of these people all at once. What did he say? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And so maybe our country now, our fellow citizens, maybe we're in a moment where we've sort of forgotten who we really are. We're not sure what people are doing, and that's okay. Our task now, we maybe can't change their minds, but we can do is following in the steps of Jesus, is just love them anyway.